I can tell even before 30 years, because I think I myself am very much a product of human mobility. My paternal grandfather is a Russo-Ukrainian who in fact fought for the Russians in defense of Russia in the Russo-Japanese War at the beginning of the last century. And my paternal grandmother was a so-called Black Sea German, similar to the Volga Germans who Tsarina Catherine the Great at the end of the 18th century had brought over to Russia to help develop industry and agriculture. And on the other side of my family, I have roots going back to the Swiss Lehmanns and to the Washington family in the UK and a few other backgrounds as well. But certainly I come from very much a migration background and in some ways I can say a multicultural background. Whether or not that is what brought me to doing the work I've been doing for the last 35 years, I'm not too sure, but certainly it has evolved from the beginning of my professional career that I've been involved professionally, full-time, without interruption in a number of fields related to human mobility, working in refugee resettlement, developing national policy in the United States to assist asylum seekers and people fleeing civil wars in neighboring Central America in the 1980s, working in the 1990s with the World Council of Churches to develop church work around the world in support of refugees and migrants, both in assuring policies that protected their rights and dignity and also making sure that when they arrived somewhere they had a job, housing, and a way to support themselves and integrate into their host societies. I worked another 12 years as senior migration specialist with the International Labor Office, basically working on issues ranging from supporting non-discrimination in law and practice in employment of migrants, as well as developing, promotion, implementation of international legal standards, international labor standards to protect rights at work, as well as human rights of migrants and other people in international mobility situations, as well as overseeing technical cooperation, capacity building projects in Africa, in Central Asia, and to a lesser extent here in Europe as well as elsewhere. And in fact, in that context, supported some work with trade unions, employers in Austria as well as elsewhere. So that's a little bit in a nutshell how I've come to be where I am, which is heading up a global expert body, trying to develop and doing some work that international organizations don't seem to be doing from a global perspective, which is looking at the whole new world of international mobility today, trying to say what do we need to have, what does each country need to have in terms of policies, practices, and attitudes to deal with the fact that, for example, as I mentioned to a colleague earlier, the current projections are that the German workforce will decline by at least 5 million over the next 15 years, the result of aging population and already a long period of low birth rates, low fertility, therefore more people leaving the labor market when they retire, not compensated for by less young people entering the labor market, at least from the national population. A situation in the context of this conference that's ironically very similar to Russia, which has lost somewhere in the neighborhood of more than 10 million members of its workforce since the year 2000. The current rates are that the national or native workforce is declining by about 1 million persons a year. So absolutely no surprise if you look at a loss of 11 million in the native workforce over the last decade and a half, that you have an estimate of around 11 million migrants, immigrants, most of whom are economically active in the Russian Federation, which puts on a conference talking about regional integration and about cooperation across a wider Europe, the whole question of mobility and the question of integration in human as well as economic terms, very much squarely at the center of the table. Well, let me step back and give you the bigger picture, which in some ways may even be more stark. The latest figures I saw in terms of fertility rates, that's to say the number of women born, or the number of children born to each woman, which is a measure in an aggregate sense of whether your population is going to increase if women have more children or whether it's going to decrease if they have fewer children. According to the current 2014 figures, 124 of the 220 recognized nations and territories around the world are at or below population replacement rate in the number of children born per woman. And to put it in the big figures, for the first time in history, in 2012, China's workforce declined. And forecasts suggest that that decline over the next 35 to 40 years may exceed 100 million members of the workforce less years from now than is the case today. And that is simply because China is such a larger country and it has had a one-child policy for a long time that finally, as is happening now, the people who entered the workforce years ago came from families with 5 or 6 children. Lots of them were entering the workforce. Now, as they retire, entering the workforce are people coming from families that had one child. And it's, on the one hand, a matter of demographics. On the other hand, there are bigger pictures and issues at play. As I often comment when I speak to policymakers, you have to look at what's happening as well in terms of the evolution of societies, of technology, of the way work is done, of the where work is done, how it's done. To the extent that technology and the technologies needed by employers change rapidly, more rapidly than even the most up-to-date educational and vocational training systems can keep up with in the most flexible societies. With the result, according to a study published a year and a half ago by a global corporate think tank called the McKinsey Global Institute, that projects that by the year 2020, which is only 6 years from now, the global shortage of high-skilled persons with tertiary educations needed by employers will be in the neighborhood of 40 million. Added to that will be a projected shortage of 45 million people with the vocational, technical, and scientific skills that are needed by employers, in particular across the developing world, including in regions like Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Meaning that we're facing the ironic paradox of having a global economy increasingly constrained by not having the skills it needs, in a situation where today 1 out of 3 jobs on offer by employers cannot be filled at the level of the skills that are required for that job. At least that's what the employers say. And at the same time, you still have growing populations and a growing surplus in parts of Africa, parts of Asia, of populations entering the labor market for whom there are no jobs, and given the often dismal situation with education, they enter the labor market, they enter the working age cohort without the skills that might get them jobs either at home or abroad, leaving us with 2 huge policy challenges. But if I can perhaps bring this discourse a little bit down to what we want to be talking about here in the next couple of days in terms of regional integration, one of the keys to the success of the European Union model has been the establishment of a larger economic space that allowed for not just free trade, but free movement and integration of capitals, production, distribution, consumption of goods, services, and the sharing of technology. And along with that was mobility of people. However, that mobility of people within the European Union has been far from adequate to provide for the growing needs that European countries have for a skilled and even a non-skilled labor force, to the extent that today about 40 to 50%, depending on which country you look at, of their immigrants are from outside the European Union. We should note, however, when we look at your migration within the European Union, that across the board, about half of the migrants in European countries come from other European countries. And the importance for the economy can be measured by looking at the fact that for most Western European countries, at least 10% of the entire workforce today is foreign-born. Here in Germany, if you add the first generation of recent immigrants, 19.6% of the German population is foreign-born or has a foreign-born parent. And I love to use the example of quintessentially Austrian Vienna, where today 49% of the Viennese population is either foreign-born or has at least one parent who's foreign-born. In some ways, it begins to sound astounding, but at the same time, that's the reality of a globalized world in which population, technological, economic dynamics mean that to function, to work, our societies need to be diverse. They need to draw on resources, including human resources, from many different places. And I'm told by some of my Austrian counterparts that Austria, for example, has been able to weather the global crisis because it has found certain niches in manufacturing. For example, highly specialized pumps that are made in a couple of Austrian cities that are the pumps that move oil out of the Middle East, that move water around out of the ground into cities around the world, and that Austrian entrepreneurs have developed a particular proficiency in producing them. But the people who are actually putting those pumps together are of Turkish origin, of Czech and Slovakian origin, and in some cases from just about anywhere else in the world. Showing that in Austria's case, the economy works in part because it has the skills and the labor power coming from all around the world that it doesn't necessarily have and will not have on its own. And if we can look at the other side of the equation we're looking at here, again, an important and growing proportion of the Russian workforce is immigrant, and ironically comes primarily from other countries that are in or will soon be part of the Eurasian Economic Union. The largest groups of migrant workers in the Russian economy come from Ukraine, Kyrgyzstan or Kyrgyz Republic, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan. And there have been, in the past, significant numbers from countries like Armenia and Azerbaijan. Ironically, here again, the bigger factors come in. Countries like Ukraine, Armenia, Azerbaijan have very low fertility rates, have already had for a number of years negative population growth, so they are no longer so easily the suppliers of labor and skills, either for the Russian economy or, as in the past, some of them went west, as you certainly know in the European or in the American situation where there are many descendants of Ukrainian, Armenian, and other Central Asian and Caucasus country origin migrants. Well, I think the world is facing or looking ahead to greater mobility and at least three factors driving it. One are the demographics. But second, and this intersects with the question you're raising, we do have a growing population. The problem is where the population is growing, the jobs are not growing, the education is not improving or expanding, either in quantity or quality. And given that the jobs are not growing and the education is not necessarily keeping up with human development and technological development, we're likely to see greater migration pressures, just as there is a greater demand, but with a huge mismatch. People seeking work wherever they can find it, but without the skills where they're going that the employers need. And at the same time, what may happen is that countries in Europe are going to face greater difficulty in obtaining the competences they need on the international market. When huge countries like China, shall I say, go on the market looking for skilled workers on an industrial scale. That 100 million decline, that's again a speculative figure, but certainly the decline over the next decades in the Chinese workforce will inevitably in the tens of millions, means that you're going to be losing people in that workforce, both at the level of low skilled, but at the level of high skilled. And at least my estimation is the loss of people is going to be quicker than technology can compensate for it by, if you will, replacing automation or increasing productivity, whether by automation or other forms of technology that make each worker more productive in the units that they can produce per hour, per day, or whatever. The point being that China, as is the case today for many European countries, will not have the option of saying no to migration, even if they seek other ways of compensating. The difficulty is economic demographers have already more or less demonstrated that even putting together factors like raising the retirement age, increasing productivity, increasing female participation in the workforce, and increasing the economic growth and output simply will not compensate for that level, meaning that immigration will be one of the options. But it will be an increasingly contentious option unless around the world we see a rapid modernization and increase in training and technological development of the people who are going to do the work. Well, the first challenge is recognizing that the need for evolving skills is going to continue to, if anything, expand as our economies and the system becomes more technologically based in terms of provision not only of production but also of services, distribution, and so on. And that both for demographic reasons and for the rapid evolution of technology, European institutions and European peoples are simply not going to, on their own, be able to provide all that's going to be needed in terms of numbers and quality. Secondly, if, as seems to be the case, there is, on the one hand, a non-employment of skills people have where they can be more effective, and alongside of that, a non-recognition of skills of people coming from other training systems in a highly mobile labor market, you're going to have an increasing contradiction between, even when the skills are there, they're not being employed effectively in a period in which both the basic needs, let alone the competitivity in a world of 6 or 7 billion people, needs effective, efficient processes of providing the goods and services as well as the basic needs of growing populations, or a growing global population at any rate, and a population in regions like this that, while not necessarily growing numerically, continues to maintain, if not add to, well, we want good school. We don't just want schools for our kids, we want good schools. We don't want just care for our aging parents, we want good quality health and personal home care for them, and so on and so forth. That's one set of issues. I think another set of issues that is a underlying set of issues that surely will come on the agenda here is the conditions of work. We're also in an economic environment often characterized as deregulatory, where work itself, for many people, becomes less permanent, more precarious, and in which across the board in many areas of work, there are indicators that show that the quality of work, the conditions of work, are often worse, or certainly worse in some sectors than they were maybe 10 years ago. And you have also certainly characterizing the result of the financial crisis for the southern European countries, a massive growth in unemployment, where your rates of youth unemployment for Greece, for Spain, for Portugal, approached or passed 50%, and where the general employment rates were reaching 25% of the working population, which again are huge related problems that push us in another direction when we look at social policy, because in those atmospheres, in a situation where you have deregulation and unemployment, migrants become all too easily targetable as the scapegoats. More migrants and more unemployment, well, it must be the migrants who are causing them, not the financial crisis, not the downsizing of employment and the attempt to do more with less to save labor costs and so on. So we enter into a whole other dimension in which making policy becomes, in some cases, almost impossible. I often say migration is the largest area of policy where the least number of decisions are made on the basis of evidence. Or to put it another way, it's the largest area of policy made on the least amount of data. And the problem is that decisions are being made by protests, by people's visceral reactions, by people's marginalization, by the native population. You know, when you're unemployed, you've got to have a target. And if somebody says, oh, it's those foreigners taking your jobs, well, sometimes people act on that, and then politicians also sometimes find that that's a good way to get votes, regardless of whether it's valid, which then means making the policies to respond to the real problems is going to be a real problem. Well, in global terms, absolutely. The problem is that in specific national or regional terms, in some cases, the jobs should be there, but they're not, because the investments have been lost, and now we're bailing out banks instead of bailing out employers to keep jobs. And we also simply have the demographic numbers that say, in some cases, the people are disappearing, and there are going to have to be people coming from somewhere outside of your particular country's border or your particular region to make sure that the jobs are there and that the jobs are filled with the right people. And by filling them with the right people, if I can be a bit simplistic, you're going to have a more effective and efficient economic system that by generating activity, generating wealth, is also going to continue to generate jobs and produce the goods and services that people need to maintain a reasonable degree of well-being. And that's true whether in Eurasia, Europe, in the Americas, or even elsewhere in the world like Africa and Asia. We are living in a changing world. We're living in a world of, on the one hand, population growth in some areas and population decline in other areas. We're living in a world in which technology and economics drive changes in what work needs to be done and the skills to do it. And the inevitable response is that working populations have to be more mobile in an aggregate sense. We need more skills and labor power in this part of the world than is going to be available given decreasing population and changing skills. And we need, in that context, to have policies and practices on the part of the state, on the part of governments, and on the part of peoples that recognize that, welcome that, and make sure that everybody in the mix gets at least fair working conditions and decent treatment.